Now you've had time to digest the first assessment instructional video. Here's a video to hopefully explain in more detail the unpacking of a unit of competency. And the unit I'm going to use is the manicure and pedicure unit. The process I'm going to be following would be the same for any unit of any qualification. And I'm going to be looking at it from the perspective of a content writer. In other words, what information does the learner need to know in order to be assessed competent? So once you've identified the answers, you can create an assessment around it. So the starting point is the unit descriptor, and these can be downloaded in Word or PDF format from training.gov.au. I would recommend downloading the unit descriptor in a Word document, as I have, because you will need to add comments to this document as you work through it. So if we have a look inside, the first thing I see is the unit descriptor and the application of the unit. And these are a good place to start because they help you visualize what evidence the learner needs to generate. And it gives you an overview of the unit and a flavour of what is expected. What I would then do is go all the way through the unit until I came to the evidence guide. And I think this is probably one of the most specific areas that you need to look at. The critical aspects are a must. So as you can see here, evidence of the following is essential. It must be covered. So we need to have evidence that students understand everything that is detailed here. Underneath that, we have the context of and specific resources for assessment. And this is another section that I would always look at first, because it details the environment and the resources required for this unit. Underneath, we have the methods of assessment, and this gives you an idea or a guide on the different types of assessment that could be used and whether or not a clustered approach is recommended. Now remember, the section is a guide, but also remember that when clustering units together, you are creating assessments that cover more than one unit. This is a useful tool and should be encouraged, but if the units don't naturally sit side by side, the assessments can become very large and the learner will find this daunting. And if I just look underneath here, you can see that they have suggested a holistic assessment with these two units here, side by side, the manicure and the pedicure. But again, it's a guide. Now, if I go back up to the performance criteria here, the performance criteria details what the learner must demonstrate to prove competency. And I find it really useful to look at each performance criteria and ascertain exactly what the learner needs to know in order to demonstrate competency. So for example, in 1.1, I can see that the learner would need to understand and create a procedure for preparing the client, herself, and the service area for a manicure and pedicure service. She would also need to know about relevant legislation and workplace policies and procedures. So how am I going to cover that? So I would write a note here on maybe a video on the preparation process, maybe a procedures list, information on the relevant health and safety rules through research, and maybe creating a section in the salon's own workplace policies and procedures manual for preparing the service area. Now I would write underneath here a note to that effect. Now, it may seem that a lot of content building has been produced for this one point, but remember, this content may be used to cover numerous points in this unit. And that's why you have the mapping document that I've given you and went over in great detail in the last video. Using the mapping document ensures you are only creating what you need. It helps you focus and reduces time spent, which is always a good thing. Now, you may also notice that some of the words have been bolded, and this means that there will be more information on them in the range statement section, which we will look at in a moment. A last point on the PCs is that the best form of evidence is direct observation. In other words, seeing a learner do something. So wherever possible, try and create a practical assessment using the practical assessment template that I have given you. Then you can fill out the gaps in what can't be demonstrated with a theory-based assessment, because beauty is a vocational subject. Learners have chosen it because it is practical. So if we load them down with huge amounts of theory assessments that are unnecessary, they're going to leave. So next we move on to the required skills and knowledge. And the first part are the required skills. Now, whenever possible, these points have to be addressed in exactly the same way as the performance criteria. So we need to try and cover them by means of practical assessment. But you still need to decide on what content you need to create in order for the student to be able to perform the practical assessment. So remember, we're creating assessments, resources, and mapping. Always do them together because this is much easier. So if we can't cover the required skills with a practical observation, we're going to fill in those gaps with a theory-based assessment. Underneath, you have the required knowledge, which is usually covered by theory-based assessments, but again, it may be appropriate to cover certain parts with a practical assessment. Just ensure all points of skills and knowledge are covered. Now we're going to look at the range statements. Now remember, we said that some of the performance criteria were in bold. Well, here they are in the range statements with more information. Now, range statements are usually divided into two types. One that says may include, and one that details must include. If a range statement is a must, you have to assess the learner and generate evidence that has covered it. If it's a may, then it means it's optional. But please, this does not mean you can ignore the mays and leave them out completely. Now at this stage, your unit description should have notes all over it. And if this isn't the case, then go back and do it again because you haven't completed the task properly. With these notes, you can now complete the mapping document and write up a list of all the content that needs to be created. Remember, we may have already got the content in our learner guides, ebook, videos, procedure manuals, and anything else that we have previously created and collected. Do not reinvent the wheel. That's the purpose of continuous improvement. Now, the content that you will be creating are your benchmark answers. Now, all you need to do is to generate assessments to go with them. And again, use the templates I've given you. This is far easier than thinking of the assessments first. All the hard work has been done. This will allow you the luxury of being creative in designing assessments to cover the content. And we need to be creative, ladies. There's nothing worse than staring at line after line of written questions. Please remember what I've said throughout this video session. Beauty, and this unit in particular, is a vocational, practical-based subject. Practical first, then the underpinning knowledge, meaning what they need to know to complete the practical. Hope this helps, and call me if you need help.